Actually, this last week I was at our annual convention. We are a part of a larger movement of churches, and it is an international movement. There's about 70,000 churches globally, and every year there's an annual gathering, and this year that's where I was, and I was invited to speak in a critical moment. I'll talk about that a little bit later. But it was really good to be in Nashville. For those of you that kind of wondered, I know some people in our culture today, we worry about whether or not the mullet has a future. Let me just tell you, after a week in Tennessee, the mullet is alive and kicking, just so you know. Like, I'm pleased to tell you, like, I think the state of Tennessee made a collective decision to say, we are not going to let the mullet die. And so for those of you that were worried, just breathe easy, because if you want to see a mullet, you can see thousands of them on the streets of Nashville. So now to the good stuff. We have been in this series looking at one of the more complicated books in the Bible, the book of Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes is a really, really strange book because it presents a sort of strange wisdom. There are wisdom teachings that are in the Bible, and then there's the teaching of Ecclesiastes, which seems to present a different kind of wisdom. It's like what I like to refer to as the wisdom that is beyond wisdom. There's sort of conventional wisdom, and then there's the wisdom for people who have experienced some life. There's the wisdom for people who have gone through some things. And so one of the things I've been saying through this series is that Ecclesiastes is not like an instruction book. It is not the kind of book where we get, if we want A, we do A, and when we get A out of that, or we say we want B, and so we do B, and we get B out of that. Ecclesiastes really is a book that's written for any of us who did A, like we followed the rules, and then somehow we got B, or we did B, and we somehow got A. Like, we made these choices, and we took direction with our lives, and then somehow that direction wound up leading us someplace we didn't expect. Ecclesiastes speaks to that. It speaks to that feeling of like, well, what was that all about? And what does that mean? It helps us understand this and process it. Ecclesiastes, I like to say this. Ecclesiastes is for anyone who said, you know, when I get this category of my life in place, like when I get it all organized, and I start checking off all of these boxes, then I'm going to feel a certain way about my life. It's for everyone that's ever done that. You check the boxes, and then you get there, and you go, well, now what? Right? That's Ecclesiastes. It goes, you're going to have these moments, and so what do you do in these moments? Ecclesiastes is for anyone who ever made it about the destination, right? They got to the point, they got to this place, and then they looked back and they realized there was all this stuff in the journey that they've been missing. That's what Ecclesiastes is all about. It's this book that says, okay, how do you experience real meaning when all of a sudden life comes to one of those points? How do you experience real joy? How do you experience real peace? How do you have a deep sense of purpose in your life when you start living enough of life to see that there are some unpredictable things that happen? How do you actually experience life in those sort of moments? And so that's what it's really talking about. And so far, this book in the book of Ecclesiastes, this journey in this has been really fascinating. At least it has been for me. I've heard from at least 2 other people that they're enjoying this series. So if you're one of those 2 people, that's great. But I think one of the other great discoveries with the book of Ecclesiastes is that we also encounter the Bible in a way that's very different. I think sometimes we approach the Bible like it's this sort of linear, 2-dimensional ancient text, and we just sort of get these principles and we think about them in a very straight line. And as the apostles say, the Bible is actually living and it's breathing and it is active. There's an aliveness to the Bible. And I think we actually experience that in Ecclesiastes, that as we enter into it, as we read its text, we're not just seeing principles and then applying them to our lives. We're actually entering into a moment. We're feeling things. We're experiencing things. There's stuff happening in Ecclesiastes where we actually encounter the aliveness of the scriptures. And then through that process, there's change that happens inside of us. There's revelation. There's like aha moments. And we go, oh no, that's what he was getting at. And there's just something very active that's taking place instead of us just neurologically observing some things and then just applying those principles to our lives. Are you with me on that? Ecclesiastes just sort of brings us into this. So today, I want to continue on, and I want to do something a little different today before we start looking at individual chapters in this book so far. I want to actually look at everything from chapter 1 to chapter 9 because there is this theme that we see, this rhythm or this pattern that we see developing throughout the entire book of Ecclesiastes. And that rhythm or that pattern, if we don't stop and look at it, we're going to miss, I think, one of the significant points that the writer was giving us. There is this larger thing that he's trying to tell us, and I think we need to stop and look at this. So a little quick summary, chapters 1 through 9, what does it look like? We're going to look at some verses along the way that seem to define these chapters and also define this pattern. So if you were here the first couple of weeks, you know chapters 1 and chapter 2. Those chapters are basically summed up like this. Everything is meaningless, right? Like there's no substance to anything. Everything is vapor, right? First two chapters, it's all about chasing after the wind. This weekend on Friday, I was mowing my lawn, and then I washed my car. And in both of those moments, I was like, I'm mowing the vapor. I'm polishing the vapor. Like, what is the point of this? It's all meaningless. It doesn't matter, right? But that's really the first two chapters. There's this phrase, actually, that gets repeated, and he says it's like chasing after the wind. And that phrase, when you think about it, that phrase epitomizes futility like nothing else. Like imagine a crazy person, because you'd have to be crazy to do it. Imagine a crazy person chasing after, trying to take hold of the wind. Like when we ever catch it, when we ever take hold of it. He says that is what life can be like. It's chasing after the wind. But then, towards the end of chapter 2, he sort of shifts gears. He moves us into a new space, a new way of thinking, and he says this in verse 24, major gear shift. He says, a person can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in their own toil. This too I see is from the hand of God, for without him, who can eat or find enjoyment? So you get this sense, it's like meaningless, and then, hey, eat a little bit and have a good time. Right? But then you flip to chapter 3, and guess what? He goes back to this meaningless theme. Chapter 3, I can summarize it in verse 19. It says this, surely the fate of human beings is like that of the animals. The same fate awaits them both. As one dies, so the other dies. All have the same breath. Humans have no advantage over animals. Everything is meaningless. Right? So we had this little moment, this little respite, and then we're right back into this. We're fully back into despair mode. That carries on into chapter 4, verse 1. We've seen this one before. He says, again, I looked and I saw all the oppression that was taking place under the sun. I saw the tears of the oppressed, and they have no comforter. And then if you aren't like given to meaninglessness yet, he continues on in chapter 5, verse 10. He says, whoever loves money never has enough, which I want to say, whoever has enough money, whether they love it or not, I don't know, right? No one ever has enough money. But he says, whoever loves money never has enough. Whoever loves wealth is never satisfied in their income. This is one more thing on your list of meaningless items you can pursue. But then, right after that, in chapter 5, we get this gear shift again. Verse 18, he says, behold, what I have seen to be good and fitting is to eat and drink and find enjoyment in all the toil with which one toils under the sun, the few days that God has given him. For this is his lot. Everyone also to whom God has given wealth and possessions and power to enjoy them and to accept his lot and rejoice, have joy in your toil. This is the gift of God. So what he's saying to us is, life can be good. Life can be enjoyed. And this is the sense you start to get. It's like somebody who's holding you down underwater lets you up for air every now and then, right? It's meaningless, and then you gasp, but life can be sort of good. And then boom, right back down under the water again. He slams us. Chapter 6, verse 3, he says this, if a man fathers 100 children and lives many years, so that the days of his years are many, but his soul is not satisfied with life's good things, and he also has no burial, I say that a stillborn child is better off than he. Right back under the water, right? That goes on. The enthusiasm continues into chapter 7, verse 29. He says this, great example of the melancholy here. He says this, see, this alone I found, that God made man upright, but they have sought out many schemes. In other words, men are evil. That's what I've seen. It's meaningless, right? Then chapter 8, he continues on. There's a vanity that takes place on earth, that there are righteous people to whom it happens according to the deeds of the wicked. In other words, bad things happen to good people. And then he goes on and says, and by the way, good things happen to bad people. And he says, I said, this is also vanity. Why in the world is this happening? This is meaningless, right? But then the next verse, he shifts gears again, lets us up for air. Verse 15, he says, and I commend joy. For man has nothing better under the sun but to eat and drink and be joyful, for this will go with him in his toil through the days of his life that God has given him under the sun. Now, chapter 9, you want to guess where he goes? There is an evil in all that is done under the sun. That same event happens to all. Also, the hearts of the children of man are full of evil, and madness is in their hearts while they live. And after that, they go to the dead. And then guess what happens next? Verse 7. Go, eat your bread with joy, and drink your wine with a merry heart, for God has already approved what you do. So there's the first 9 chapters basically summarized of Ecclesiastes, right? So you have meaningless, but there's a little bit of joy and a little bit of purpose out there. And then there's meaningless and more meaningless. And then he says, but you can eat and drink and be a little merry for a while. And then he says, but life is meaningless. And then you hear like Bobby McFerrin whistling in the background, don't worry, be happy, right? And you're like, how in the world do you draw this conclusion? Like, what do you do with this, right? You got all this meaninglessness, and then you're like, have a little bit of joy, but it's all meaningless. Have a little joy. Like, at some point, you have to stop and ask the question, which one is it, right? I mean, you read this, and at some point, you stop and go, can you just give me a sense of which one life really is? Like, are we going to live life like Eeyore listening to Bob Dylan in the basement, right? Or is it going to be Tigger with Bob Marley on the beach somewhere? Because that's basically the 2 choices that are being given me, right? Bob Dylan, Bob Marley, which one do you want, right? Is the writer saying that life is meaningless and it's all despair and you're going to die like a dog? Or is he saying you can eat and drink and enjoy your life and everything is going to be all right? Which is it? Now, I hope at this point in the series, you know that if I say to you, is it door number 1 or is it door number 2? The answer is what? Yeah, door number 3 or yes, right? That's kind of where Ecclesiastes leads us. Is there perhaps another way to understand this? With all of this picture that he's painting, is he actually trying to communicate something about how we move through our days? Is he actually telling us something about life? And I want to get into the wisdom that is beyond the obvious of this. I want to get into the deeper thing that he's communicating. And I want to do this because I really think he's illuminating with this pattern something that some of us really need to hear. I think this is going to be valuable for everyone in the room, but I think there are certain people in the room this morning, this is going to hit a little more specifically, and it's going to bring a little more life to some things that are going on. And so I want to look at this, and I want to unpack this really by just sharing some of my journey, including just the events of this past week. As I mentioned, I was speaking down in Nashville, huge event, 4,000 of my peers in a room, high-pressure moment. In fact, the moment that I was speaking, I was actually tasked with speaking the moment after the new president of our organization was voted for and elected in this moment. Huge moment, very emotional. In fact, I had so many friends coming up to me and they were like, what did you do to deserve this? Like, I had one friend, he goes, so your job is to like, I don't even know. And he just walked away from me. And I was like, it was that kind of stressful situation where I have to get up and bring meaning and purpose to it in the middle of a circumstance that was really kind of tense. And so it brought back all sorts of memories. And I'll just share a couple of them with you. When I first made the decision to be in some sort of ministry, like when I started pursuing Jesus more intensely, I was in college. I was like 19 or 20, and I chose to do an internship. I come to this realization, like I was a Latin American history major, and I know there's lots of money in Latin American history. But I was like, you know what? It's not about the money, right? And so went into ministry, right? Because that just gives you some perspective on things right there, right? So I made this decision. I wanted to be an intern. And so I signed up to be an intern, an internship with my college pastor. His name was Rob. I thought he was my friend. But his way of like training me, I called it shock therapy because he was always just springing things on me. He was always dropping these things like, go do this or go do that. And he wouldn't give me any prep time. And this one Sunday morning, I show up to our college ministry. That's where I was interning. I had certain responsibilities. I get there early. He comes over to me and he says, hey, I want you to know that this afternoon at 1 o'clock, you're speaking at such and such retirement center. You're conducting their chapel. I'm like, what? I've never spoken to adults at this point. Like, I have barely spoken things in my journal to me that Jesus said. Like, I've written down some very weak thoughts on my relationship with Jesus. I think they invited me to speak to some junior hires. They never invited me back. Like, I don't have content that I can come up with. And not only that, I had responsibilities. And so all morning long, I'm like trying to come up with something. I'm like writing ideas down. I'm putting things together. And I'm like, okay, I'm finally ready. So at 12:30, we go to this retirement center. We get in the elevator, and it's on the 5th or 6th floor of this building. I remember going up, and my heart is beating out of my chest. I'm like, I can't believe I'm going to speak to adults. I don't know what I'm doing here, you know. And in fact, in one moment, I thought, Jesus, if this is what it looks like to love you, I'm not sure I do, right? It's one of those things, like what is this all about? And so the elevator door opens up. There's this little hallway. We step across it into a room. The room is so tiny, it holds about 10 chairs, a gigantic pulpit from some church that must have been like throwing it out and they donated it instead. And it's like this massive thing. And then there's a piano. And when we walk in the room, there's a lady playing on the piano. And I think she was leading worship for the 4 other people in the room, but nobody else is paying attention. She's just up there jamming away, right? So immediately I walk into this. They introduce me. I step behind the world's largest podium. And I realized you couldn't get a more uncomfortable, awkward scenario, right? So I stand there, I look at my notes, I look at what I've written, and I'm like, well, that doesn't work. Like everything I'm thinking about saying, I'm like, none of this makes sense. I'm looking at the 4 senior citizens sitting in front of me, and I'm like, none of the stuff that this 19-year-old has written is going to make sense to them, or 20-year-old. And so I start talking, but then I start doing something that I'm going to recommend. If you're a public speaker, don't ever do this. I started editing on the fly. I just started thinking, you know what, that doesn't work, so I'll just skip that. And that doesn't work, so I'll skip that. That doesn't work. So eventually I'm bringing this thing in for a landing, which by the way was supposed to be about 20 to 25 minutes. I get down, I'm coming in for a landing, and I look at the clock, and I am at 7 minutes. And Rob, the guy I'm interning with, he's in the back, and he looks at me, he just goes, keep going, keep going. So here's the second piece of advice I'll give you, and it's this. If you're public speaking and what you have said didn't make sense the first time, do not go back and start over. But that's what I did. I literally stood there. I was like, well, I guess, let me say it another way. And I went back to the beginning, and basically said the exact same thing. I'm not joking when I said, at one point in the middle of this, there's this one lady, she just got up, looked at me, and then walked out of the room. Like she knew. She's like, he just started over. We've seen it before. We've seen this before. Fast forward a couple years, I'm the executive pastor at a church, about 600 or 700 person church. I was 24 years old. And I'm getting invited to speak on a Sunday morning for the first time, group kind of like this size. And I'm getting ready to speak for the first time ever to adults and on a Sunday morning. And this is I'm stoked about this. I'm teaching on Acts chapter 17. And Acts chapter 17 is this amazing story where the Apostle Paul goes to Athens and he preaches this gospel-centered message to the Athenians who worshiped all of these different gods. In fact, they had a statue in Athens to an unknown god, and they worshiped that one, basically saying, well, if there's a god out there that we don't know of, we don't want to make him mad, so we worship that God too. And so he's speaking to them about this, and he says, basically, this statue is evidence that you are groping in the darkness for something to hold on to, that you're trying to find something in your blindness that you can hold on to. And then he begins to tell them about who Jesus is. Well, I'm telling the story, and I decide I'm going to unpack the word groping of all words. And so I start telling this story, which, by the way, this is still true today. I tell them, hey, when a noise happens in the middle of the night, I don't know why I do this, but it's my one moment of bravery. Whenever something happens, I always jump out of bed and I run towards the noise. I'm just that's my one moment of I'm going to be brave, and I always charge into the darkness. And so I tell everybody this. I'm like, hey, so I charge into the darkness. The problem is I'm blind, and so I rarely take my glasses with me, which means I'm usually finding myself someplace in that house, fumbling around, looking for a lamp or a light switch, and I literally say this in this sermon. I say, and then I hear Sherry call my voice from the bedroom, and that's when the groping begins. Now, I just pictured myself down the hallway. I didn't even hear what was coming out of my mouth. So then when the whole crowd sees that I don't know what I said, and then they see the moment that I know what I said, they just explode into laughter again. And I'm just sitting there paralyzed. I just stood and I turned around. I walked to the back wall. I just took a couple of deep breaths, and I just was I'm going to pretend that never happened. And I just tried to start back. Still trying to live that moment down. A few years later, I was 27. I was in the Czech Republic. I was speaking at a huge revival, conference type thing up by the Polish border in the Czech Republic. And I had to speak with a translator, which that's not something that I'm good at, because if you notice, I talk a little fast sometimes. And when I was younger, I talked even faster. And so I had to figure out this whole thing. So I was struggling the first couple of days. But then on the third day, I'm I got this thing down, and I'm starting to figure out how to do it. So I'm feeling pretty good about speaking through a translator. But in this one gathering, actually the largest gathering that I would speak to at this event, I noticed that every time I say something, in 3 seconds, the translator takes 12 seconds to say what I was saying. So I'm 3 seconds on, and then 12, and then 3, and then 12, which gives me a lot of time to think about all sorts of things, right? And as I'm going along, I'm feeling pretty good, but I start noticing people are not, their affect is lowering. People are frowning at me. There's people crossing their arms. There's people that are just they look confused. The whole thing, I'm this is not okay. So eventually the whole thing comes in for a landing. Everyone sort of dissipates, and this one person comes up to me, and she says, she goes, where did you get your translator? The official people gave him to me. I don't know. When I showed up, they gave me this guy. She goes, do you know that he kept saying things that were the opposite of what you were saying? And a couple of times even said, I don't agree with him. What I believe he should be saying is this. It explained the 12-second gap, right? Literally all the disgruntled faces, they made sense to me in this moment. So fast forward to this last week, and I'm standing in front of a group of my peers, and right before I go up, somebody comes up to me and they say, "So are you nervous?" Well, if you lived my life, would you be nervous, right? Because there's a certain amount of unpredictability, right? Let me just tell you this. The illusion that I know what I'm doing when I get up here week after week, it is a false illusion. I never know what's going to happen, okay? We never know what's going to take place. And by the way, isn't that life? Isn't it just like life that we have all these circumstances and we think it's supposed to go this way? But if we all told our life story right now, we have a litany of examples where we thought it would go this way and then it went that way. And there is this unpredictability to life. There is this unpredictability to what's happening around us. We've had enough experience to realize we don't control the outcomes, do we? As much as we think we do, we don't control the outcomes. Like when you charge into something, when you go, you know what, I'm going to go do this thing, and I'm going to ask good questions, and I'm going to lay out a plan, and I'm going to think through the strategy, and I'm going to be really disciplined. You know that no matter what you do, when you charge into something new, a relationship, a business venture, something spiritually related, when you do that, there is still a chance, no matter what you do, there's still a chance it is all going to go up in smoke. Right? There's still a chance that everything's going to fall apart. There's still a chance somebody's going to translate you the wrong way, right? There is always the possibility that things are going to go south. And yet somehow you and I fall into this pattern of believing that there are predictable things that we are in control of. Like we still find ourselves believing that we're in control. For some reason, this modern world we live in, it's like propagating this illusion that we are in control. And the truth is that control is an illusion. I know that makes some of you control freaks really nervous right now. But control is an illusion, and that's what the teacher in Ecclesiastes is telling us with this larger pattern. He's saying there's all this stuff that happens and all these different things, and at some point as you're reading all of it, you start to realize, I'm not in control. And so then he says, in the middle of you not being in control, there's an alternative. There's another way. There's another way to live with all this other stuff that's going on that you can't control. There is a way to find peace and joy and meaning and happiness. So the wisdom writer, he's saying this. He's giving us these two columns, and what he's really showing us is this. You and I will only find true joy, and we're only going to find true peace, and we're only going to find true meaning when we face down the possibility of our own futility. Right? When we finally come to the point of realizing, you know what, I can work and work and work, and still the results might not be what I expect them to be. At some point, you and I come to this place of realizing I can do all sorts of stuff, and I might not get what I want. When you face that possibility that your actions might not land on the results you wanted, when you surrender the desired outcomes, and you acknowledge that you're powerless, now you become free to enjoy. See, that's the freedom. The freedom is when you go, you know what? I don't control the outcomes. All I control is me in this moment. Which is really interesting. I mean, do you know somebody who made a 5-year plan? Anybody know someone that made a 5-year plan? Does anybody know somebody that made a 5-year plan and in 5 years their plan turned out to look like their life? I don't know anybody that's worked that way, right? Have you noticed this? Like there's people that go, well, in 5 years I'm doing this, I got a mid-range goal, and I've asked this for this advice, and I'm doing these things, and I'm charging down this road. And then like 5 years later, you look at their life and you go, what happened? They go, man, there's just all sorts of crazy stuff I didn't see coming, right? Because that's life, right? You can plan and you can strategize and you can do all those things, and that happens to people, right? You can pour yourself into things. Think about this. Do you know anybody? Do you know someone who poured themselves into their kids? Right? They showed them how to love and follow Jesus. They gave them a good education. They made sure they could go to college. They did all this stuff. And at some point, like 18, 19, 20, 25, whoever, they just sort of turned their back on them and everything else. And you see them and you kind of go, what happened? Like you poured your life into your kid. And then like sometimes we go, there must have been stuff in the background. No, a lot of times there's not. A lot of times there's really good parents and those kids just sort of wander off in some weird direction. And you scratch your head and you go, what happened? Well, that happens. Sometimes you put your hand to something and you don't get the result you expected, and there's no explanation for it. So sometimes we get a cause, something we're going to do, we want to make a difference in the world. Do you know somebody who has said, I want to solve homelessness, or I want I want to solve the clean water problem in our world today. I want to address HIV and AIDS in East Africa. We just have these things you get passionate about, and you know somebody that's poured themselves into it, right? They give their lives to it, their money, their resources, their time, and then at some point they sort of wake up and they start questioning, have I even moved the needle? Like, has it even gone a centimeter of difference? I've done all this with my life, and they begin to become disenfranchised and delusional, and not delusional, but disillusioned, and they go, what is the purpose of all of this, right? What is the purpose of all of it? See, it isn't until we face the possibility of our own futility, this could just be futile, that we realize that we might pour our lives into something and it barely make a dent. It's not until that moment that things begin to make sense. That's when we break through into a new way of living. That's when we begin to live an entirely different kind of existence. So the writer of Ecclesiastes, he is not saying it is either or. He's saying this: do you want to enjoy life? Do you want to find joy? Do you want to have peace? Do you want to have meaning? Well, then begin by acknowledging your powerlessness and surrender the outcomes. Surrender the outcomes. Give them up. Quit worrying about him. Start facing the possibility that you might work, and people might not ever appreciate you for what you do. People might never listen to the advice you give. People might never take the stuff you preach in sermons and live it in their lives. Get okay with that at some point, because then you're actually free. That's what the writer of Ecclesiastes is telling us today. Which means that for any of us in the room where there's something that we are like white knuckle grip holding on to some outcome, he's saying, why are you doing this? For any of us in the room where we have some outcome that we have buried it in our hearts, and we've said, unless this thing happens this way, unless things turn out according to this, I'm not going to be happy or not going to have. He's saying, would you let go of the outcomes? All you have is you in the moment that's right in front of you. That's all you have. Let me give you something else. John chapter 21. I love connecting what the writer in Ecclesiastes says to what Jesus is actually inviting us into. So John chapter 21. There's this really interesting conversation that Jesus has with Peter. And there's this sort of ragged heart and soul, kind of a raw, open conversation that takes place. And Jesus is saying to Peter, he says 3 times, he says, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? And every time he says, do you love me, it's a different word that he uses. And if you've heard that story before, you know that he's trying to get around these different angles of relationship with Jesus. He's saying, do you love me? And Peter is trying to understand, like, what is Jesus getting at? And Jesus is sort of defining the relationship. Like, when I invited you to follow me, what was I actually inviting you into? What was I actually having you come experience? And so he's asking these questions. He's digging into this because he wants Peter to see, like, what is this really all about? And then Jesus says this in verse 18. He says, very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and you went where you wanted. In other words, when you were younger, you had this illusion that you were in control of the outcomes. You had this illusion that you would just do whatever you wanted to do and you would get wherever you wanted to go. But when you're old, you'll stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you don't want to go. Then he continues on in verse 19. It says, Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. By the way, there's a death that glorifies God. I know we're uncomfortable with that, but that's what he says. And then he says to Peter, not for the first time, he says to him again, follow me. Will you follow me with an understanding that you are not in control of the outcomes? I think this is a really clarifying moment because I think for some of us, we choose to follow Jesus as a way of getting our outcome. I have my outcomes, and I'm going to follow Jesus in an effort to let Jesus give me what I want. But Jesus says to Peter, he says, I'm going to give you some things you don't want. And you're going to have some outcomes you're not anticipating. Will you still follow me? Will you follow me in this? And basically what he's saying to Peter in this moment, it's 2 very simple words. He's just saying, let go. Let go of the outcomes. Let go of the expectations. Let go of the assumptions. Let go of the plans. Let go of all of the ways that you have wrapped your heart around this illusion that you're in control. Let go of these things. When Jesus invites us to follow him, he's saying, let go of those things. Like, those things are out there in the distance, and basically what he's saying is, would you let me slide right here in between, and then don't take your eyes off of me. You look at me. I know there's that stuff that's out there. I know we don't know how it's going to turn out. I just want you to look at me. You look at me and let's just walk. You just follow me in this. That is what Jesus is inviting us into. And let me just tell you that I didn't understand this for years and years. For years and years, I was stuck thinking that Jesus was supposed to lead me where I wanted him to take me, not just some place I didn't want to go. And every time things didn't turn out the right way, every time the outcome wasn't what I wanted it to be, it absolutely ruined me. It could be small, it could be big, but it just messed with the moments that I was in. I would lose joy, I would lose peace, and I would lose any sense of meaning because I didn't know what's happening here. Things aren't turning out how I expected them. And there would be this sort of sickness that would trickle into the moments that I was in. So there's this moment when Jesus, other place in the Gospels, where he's talking to his disciples, and he says, anybody who wishes to save their life will lose it. In other words, anybody who goes, I want my outcomes to be like this, this, and this. Anyone who says, this is the way my life is supposed to look. You're going to lose any sense of life. You're going to lose any sense of joy. You're going to lose peace. You're going to lose meaning. You're not going to have those things. But then he follows that up and he says, but anyone who loses their life for me and the gospel, you find life. Anyone who lets me step in between them and the outcomes that they're perceiving they deserve in their life. Anyone who lets me come into that middle ground, anyone who does that, when you do that, you will find in this moment, you will experience peace and joy and life and meaning. You will experience it. And what we're hearing from the writer of Ecclesiastes all the way to Jesus is this, that your sense of meaning and your sense of joy, your sense of peace, your sense of freedom, it is all deeply connected to your ability to let go of the results. The more you let go of the results, the more you quit caring about how things turn out, the more you just consider, what am I called to be in this moment, the more you will experience meaning and joy and peace and freedom. Are you with me on this? So the question is this. What is it? What's the thing? Maybe it's a category of things, but what are the things in your life where if they don't turn out the way you expected, if it's a health thing, if it's a money thing, if it's a relationship thing, if it's a career thing, if it's an education thing, what is that thing that if it doesn't turn out the way you expected, it's going to take life from you? It's going to steal your peace and your joy and your sense of meaning. All of us have something like that. All of us have something where if that got messed with, it would really mess with us. And I believe what Jesus is inviting us into today is an opportunity to say, no, you know what? I'm going to give that to you. I'm going to give up the outcomes. I'm going to do right now what I think you've told me to do. And I don't know what the 5-year plan is going to look like. I don't have that in view. All I have is this right in front of me. Let go of it. Because that will lead to life. Amen? Would you guys stand with me? Sometimes I come to the end of a service and I look at the clock in the back and I have like 1 minute left and I'm like, I could say more stuff. And then it turns to 12 o'clock on the nose right when I look at it and I'm like, I guess I'm done. Today's one of those days when I wish I could say more. But let me say this. May you find meaning, and may you find joy, and may you have peace. Not because you planned and strategized, but because you follow Jesus. Amen? Amen. Love you guys so much. Have an amazing rest of your Sunday. Next week, I know some of you want relief from Ecclesiastes, but we have 3 more weeks in it. So look forward to that, and we'll see you guys next Sunday. See you later.